Corsair tortures the cruelest practices of piracy. Welcome to this channel. Today we're diving into a truly gripping topic, Corsair tortures. Get ready to uncover the most ruthless practices of piracy, exploring stories of inhumane punishments and terrifying methods of intimidation. The journey will be divided into 9 sections, each of which will take you into the dark heart of piracy. In this text, we'll delve into the cruelest tortures used by Corsairs throughout history, revealing the horrific practices employed to intimidate, punish, and extract information from prisoners. Organized into 9 tales, this journey will take us to the grim heart of piracy, filled with unimaginable violence and unbounded ruthlessness. The whip's punishment. The whip was one of the most common tortures among Corsairs. Whippings were administered both as disciplinary punishment and as a method of intimidating prisoners and crew members. The whip's ropes were often reinforced with knots or metal fragments to cause deeper wounds and unbearable pain. The scars left by the lash were not just physical marks, but also represented the Corsairs' total control over those under their rule. This method inflicted intense physical suffering and a deep psychological impact, instilling fear and obedience. The whip was often used as a public spectacle to maintain order and ensure everyone understood the cost of disobedience. Some were whipped to death, while others survived with severe injuries, forever haunted by the pain and humiliation endured. The humiliation of walking the plank. Walking the plank, made famous by pirate tales, was one of the most brutal forms of execution. The prisoner was often blindfolded and had their hands tied, forced to walk on a wooden plank suspended above open sea. With each step, tension grew, and the prisoner knew the inevitable fate awaiting them: a deadly fall into the ocean, where sharks often awaited to devour anyone who fell. Corsairs watched with sadistic pleasure, frequently laughing or mocking the condemned. This practice was more than a punishment. It was a form of public humiliation, a warning to anyone who dared to oppose the pirates. The fear of being cast into the sea, where no help could reach you, was a powerful tool for controlling prisoners and crew alike. The despair of those facing the plank was often etched in the eyes of witnesses, creating an atmosphere of terror and submission. Bamboo under the nails torture. Bamboo under the nails was one of the most devastating tortures, both physically and psychologically. This practice involved sliding thin bamboo sticks under the prisoner's nails, causing excruciating, unbearable pain. The pain was so intense that victims would often faint, only to be revived and subjected to the torture again. This method was used to force prisoners to confess or reveal important information, such as the location of hidden treasures or attack plans. Not only was the physical pain unbearable, but the psychological terror of repeated torture was enough to break the resistance of many. Those who endured this torture were scarred for life, with permanent damage to their hands and deep psychological wounds. It was a perfect example of the Corsairs' cruelty, who had no limits in their desire to obtain what they wanted. The iron cage. The iron cage was one of the most inhumane and humiliating punishments inflicted by Corsairs. Victims were locked in small iron cages suspended over the ship's deck or in public squares, exposed to the elements and the gaze of all. The cage was so cramped it prevented any movement, forcing the prisoner into an uncomfortable and painful position. Without food or water, many prisoners died slowly from dehydration or exposure, while spectators watched their agony. The iron cage was a warning to anyone who dared to oppose the Corsairs or threaten their authority. Each day spent in the cage was a torture, both physically and mentally, depriving the prisoner of all hope and dignity. The prolonged suffering and awareness of being on display made this torture one of the most feared. It was a slow death sentence, where the victim could only pray for a quick end. Salt water. Salt water was used as a torture tool to intensify the pain of open wounds. Corsairs poured salt water directly onto prisoners' wounds, causing unbearable stinging and significantly increasing the risk of infections. This method not only caused agonizing pain, but often led to severe infections that could be fatal. The aim was to break the prisoner's spirit, making them more likely to cooperate or confess. Salt water was readily available on board ships, making this a common torture method. Prisoners were often tied down to prevent movement, while salt water was poured slowly, prolonging the agony. This torture was intended not only to inflict physical pain, but also to crush the prisoner's will, leaving them in a state of absolute despair. The The feeling of helplessness and the awareness that the pain would continue as long as their captors wanted made this practice particularly cruel. The torture wheel. The torture wheel was one of the most macabre tools used by Corsairs to inflict extreme suffering. Victims were tied to a large wooden wheel, and once immobilized, the wheel was slowly turned as Corsairs struck different body parts with sticks, clubs, or whips. This torture aimed to inflict continuous, prolonged pain, causing fractures, internal injuries, and in many cases, a slow, painful death. The wheel was often used publicly as a warning to those who dared to oppose the Corsairs or betray their code. The victims' screams were part of the horror the Corsairs sought to spread, instilling terror not only in prisoners but also among their own men. Being tied to the wheel meant losing all hope of escape or rescue, as the torture continued until the body could no longer endure. This brutal practice showed how far Corsairs were willing to go to maintain control and demonstrate their power. Hanging at midship. Hanging at midship was one of the most terrifying and symbolic punishments carried out by Corsairs. The prisoner was hoisted by a rope and hung from the ship's main mast, left dangling until they took their last breath. This act was often performed in front of the entire crew and prisoners as a warning to anyone considering rebellion or breaking the rules imposed by the Corsairs. Hanging was not only a punishment but a clear and direct message. Disobedience would be punished with death. This type of execution was also a form of public spectacle, with Corsairs ensuring that everyone watched to instill fear and submission. The victims' slow agony, as they writhed while struggling to breathe, left an indelible image for those watching. It was a stark reminder of the Corsairs' absolute power and the inevitable fate awaiting anyone who dared challenge them. Branding. Branding was a cruel and degrading punishment used by Corsairs to mark prisoners permanently. Using a hot iron, symbols or letters were branded onto the victim's skin, often on the chest or arm, as a sign of ownership or as punishment for betrayal. This practice was intended to humiliate the prisoner deeply, leaving them marked for life with a brand that told of their suffering and submission. The pain of the hot iron against the skin was unbearable, but the torture did not end there. The wounds took a long time to heal and often became infected, causing further suffering. Branding represented total control, as the victim could never escape the mark of their submission. It was a constant reminder of the Corsairs' power and the shame endured, a visible scar identifying the prisoner as one who had suffered their cruelty. Evisceration. Evisceration was one of the most brutal and horrifying tortures used by Corsairs, reserved for the most hated enemies, or those who had committed the gravest betrayal. The victim was tied, often in front of the entire crew or a public square, and with merciless precision, the Corsairs began removing internal organs while the victim was still alive. This torture was meant to instill terror and inflict maximum pain, turning the prisoner into a living example of the fate awaiting those who dared challenge the Corsairs' authority. Evisceration was not just an act of punishment, but a means of spreading terror and showcasing the Corsairs' absolute lack of mercy. Anyone witnessing such a scene was scarred for life, further amplifying the Corsairs' reputation as ruthless torturers. Evisceration was the ultimate act of domination, an action that left no room for compassion or redemption, only pure and raw brutality. These 9 torture practices were part of the cruel reality of Corsair life. Their actions, driven by the need to intimidate and maintain power, demonstrate the depths of human brutality in the name of control and dominance. If you enjoyed the video and want to hear more stories of piracy and the sea's secrets, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next video.